Good afternoon to everyone who's gathered here at the Brookings Institution's Falk Auditorium. I'm Suzanne Maloney. I'm Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at Brookings, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our Alan and Jane Batkin Leaders Forum, the first of 2024. The Batkin International Leaders Forum brings world leaders and senior officials together to Brookings for major policy discussions. Today, we're honored to be joined by Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Espen Barth Eide, and we look forward to a critical and rigorous discussion on European security landscape. Minister Eide has a long career in foreign policy and international affairs, having served previously as Norway's Minister of Defense. He has also served as the United Nations Undersecretary General, the Secretary General Special Advisor on Cyprus. He was Managing Director of the World Economic Forum in Geneva. Welcome back to Brookings, Minister Eide. I cannot think of anyone better to join Minister Eide on our stage here today in this discussion than our own Fiona Hill. Fiona is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, and she's a world-renowned expert on Russia. She previously served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the U.S. National Security Council, as well as National Intelligence Officer at the U.S. National Intelligence Council. Before we begin, let me note that the Government of Norway provides support to Brookings, which helps make the work that we do on international security and peace possible. Today's event is not supported by or in any way related to that funding. I'd like to reiterate that Brookings' commitment to independence in our research, scholarship, and outreach is sacrosanct. And I'd underscore that today, like all events and all that we do here at Brookings, the views expressed are solely those of the speakers. A reminder that we're currently streaming live and that we'll be taking questions from both those here in the audience and the many, many who are joining us digitally. You can submit your questions via email to events@brookings.edu or on social media using the hashtag Ukraine. Mics will also come around the audience here for those of you in the auditorium during the Q&A session. We look forward to a great conversation. Over to you, Fiona and Minister Eide.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. Can everyone hear? Fine, yeah. It actually sounds great from this angle, but you never know how it sounds at the very back. So everyone at the back can hear as well, yeah? Fantastic. Well, Minister, it's really fantastic to have you here. As Suzanne said, you've had a very long and varied career, and touching on so many of the issues that we want to talk about today. And of course, we're also meeting ahead of some major events next week in Europe. The Munich Security Conference is going to be one of them. Norway also hosts a major energy conference in Oslo, which is also next week. All of these events obviously shape a lot of the discussions about critical issues. And although, of course, we haven't on the agenda really got many questions about climate change, I mean, obviously that is a backdrop to many of the issues that we're talking about today. We did get quite a few questions in online already, so what I'll try to do is weave some of them in. I might have to put my glasses on because the font is so small that I can't make most of them out. But a lot of them are, in fact, dealing with the issues that we said we were going to already have on the agenda. And of course, many of those questions are really related to how we see the current state of war in Ukraine, and of course, really critical questions, not just about US support, and you're here in the United States, we know, with a whole series of meetings in Washington, D.C., but also the nature of European support in the EU. Now, I mean, I don't think most people in this audience need a reminding, but many people might. Norway is not a member of the European Union. But of course, you are adjacent, and you are a key member, a founding member of NATO. So obviously you have a pretty critical role here in everything that happens in the European security space. And I mean, I'd like just for a few minutes to talk about how, you know, everything that's happened has really shifted Norway's security perspective. Because of course you have a border with Russia. You had a border with the Soviet Union before the collapse of the Soviet Union. As one of NATO's founding members, you're the country that's continuously had a direct border. You've also got major issues with Russia in the Barents Sea, where you had to do a delineation issue, and you share responsibility in part over Svalbard, one of the major islands in the north in the Arctic Sea. So you've got a very complicated set of relationships here. And how does that really shape your perspective on what's happening?
Well, thank you, Fiona. Let me first say that it's great to be here with you, Susan, and at Brookings, which I appreciate very much, an institution I've been working with for so many years in so many capacities. Always a pleasure to be here. So, and thank you all for coming. And I'd like to say initially that the issues we will be discussing here is, in my view, still the number one security concern, at least for the western part of the world, I would say for the world, because it's a live war going on in the middle of Europe. We've had a lot of civil wars and transnational wars, a lot of violence, but actually one large country invading another large country in a context where, although Ukraine was not an ally, was still a friend close to the West, is more dramatic than most of what we've seen, not only since the end of the Cold War, but even inside the Cold War, because this is unique and it's different. And it's important to remember that, because there's a lot of issues. As a foreign minister, I engage on so many other issues. And right now, of course, the Middle East, Gaza, the terrible situation. I'm sure we can touch upon that if anybody's interested. But there's something very unique to the fact that we first had the invasion of Crimea, and annexation of Crimea and parts of Ukraine, and then the full-scale intervention that happened almost 2 years ago. In a couple of weeks, it's 2 years, not anniversary, but we mark 2 years, and the war is still very intense. This will shape the security architecture of Europe. Whatever happens, whatever outcome, will be historic in the sense that, for good or bad, it will influence how we think about security in our part of the world. And it matters to America. It matters a lot to America, because although I totally understand and realize that the rise of China is important, Middle East is important, your closest friends and allies and economic partners are in Europe, and that matters to us and it matters to you. And then you mentioned Norway. Norway is a founding father of NATO, not member of EU, but close to the EU, collaborating on many fronts. But our primary security arrangement is NATO. Right. We care a lot about NATO. Currently, we also have the NATO Secretary General, who was recently here, and my old boss, because I served in all his governments, actually, before he went on to the global stage. And we also have that unique feature. I'm happy you mentioned that. We are the only country that both had and have a border with Russia in NATO. What I mean by that is that we were of the old NATO. It was Turkey, and Norway, and now Turkey is still in NATO, but without a border with Russia, because that border now turned into Georgia and other countries. Whereas we still have a border with Russia. Hence, we have a very long-standing experience in dealing both with the Soviet Union and then Russia, and how you deal with that also in difficult times, not in the long run. So right now, we have decided to take Ukraine very seriously. A year ago, we launched a support package, which is one of the largest in the world for Ukraine. According to some German statistics, a Kyiv Institute, which is trying to count this, it said that we are the number 5 donor, but in absolute terms, not in relative terms. It's of America, EU, Germany, UK, and Norway. And what's interesting with that program, and what I know that President Zelensky appreciates, it's big, yes. It's flexible. It's both civilian and military, because you need bombs and ammunition and weaponry and training, but you also need, you need to send kids to school and have, you need to have hospitals and electricity and energy supplies even in the midst of war, but it's flexible. But the most important thing is it's long term, 5 years. Yeah. And to start with a small piece of good news, before we go on into all the trouble, there is now a trend in other European countries also to establish these long-term programs. Denmark has done it. Kudos to them. The EU just did a week ago. European Union, 50 billion euros, which is a little more than $50 billion, but over 4 years. And the point here is to say we decide now that it will be a sustained commitment. That's very different from saying we give you a lot of money now and maybe next year, right. Because what the Ukrainians need to know is that this is sustained support. So I take some credit that we might have inspired the others to have these longer plans. And then I guess we will go into how it's going, because the war is not easy. Wars are never easy, and they're never happen according to plan. They definitely did not happen according to Putin's plan, which is great. But the counteroffensive from Ukraine didn't really happen according to plan either. So we're in it for the long haul, and part of what we can do as friends of Ukraine, who are not sending our soldiers to die, is to make sure that our commitment is credible and long-term.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to push you on a couple of these issues here. You mentioned that Norway is number 5 after US, EU, Germany, and the UK. And of course, there is a bit of criticism within the EU right now of Norway. I mean, as you said, you're adjacent and not a member, because one of the arguments is that Norway has benefited immensely from the war because of the rupture of Russian gas, particularly to Germany. I mean, UK obviously was not in the same position. And of course, Norway has had a major windfall as a result of that. You've got a very robust and very large sovereign wealth fund, which you've always used very much in the past for development purposes. I mean, that was the whole purpose it's one of the titles of the fund. But when you look at these debates in other countries, I mean, Germany last year was said to be the worst performing economy in Europe. It's according to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times after, decades, obviously, of growth. The UK is not in, the greatest of shape. And we're hearing things, including from the Hungarian government, the Slovaks, saying we cannot afford, basically to have Ukraine in Europe, or we can't afford, to basically keep paying for Ukraine. I mean, that puts, in a way, even more of a spotlight on Norway, because your economy is performing well. You're getting revenues from energy, becoming one of the major key energy providers at a critical time to Europe. I mean, how do you feel that you can contend with that? Because, again, it puts more of an onus on you perhaps than it was before.
Yeah, very fair question, and that's absolutely part of the debate. Actually, that's one of the reasons that we give such a major contribution, because just for reference, I mean, you might not walk around with population figures in your head. Norway is 5.5 million people, Germany is 80. And so when we are among the 5, of course, the per capita contribution is immensely much bigger, as they should be for exactly those reasons. That it should be because yes, there was a lot of windfall income from the war. But remember that what we did was that we were able to replace a large part of Russia's gas exports to Europe. That had a very significant security policy meaning for the Europeans, because I think we all agree now that Europe became including Germany, for instance, way too dependent on Russian gas, and much of the European economy was fueled literally by relatively cheap Russian gas, and that created a dependency that had to be broken. And it was us, followed by Azerbaijan, who was ready to compensate the gas by stepping up our production. We helped Europe to become almost totally independent of European gas. That was a good thing. But of course, the way the market works, of course, some of that money also, and a lot of that money, frankly, ended up in Norway. And we saw that as an argument for why we needed to take a particular role with Ukraine, indeed.
When you put that into the security terms, I mean, I already mentioned in my little spiel at the beginning there that you've got this also unusual relationship with Russia, because you, in a way, don't quite share sovereignty, but you share, kind of some sovereignty and administration of Svalbard, which is a major mining and mineral. And this goes also back a very long time in that relationship. You've got this shared area of the Barents Sea for fisheries. It took a long time to work that out for delineation. At the same time, though, during the Cold War, you were at the forefront of that security belt that went from the Arctic seas into the North Atlantic, Greenland, Iceland. They called it the GUC, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. Norway played a role in securing that. You're back there again. I mean, how can you balance off those kinds of tricky relationships with Russia that so far, in the Arctic have not risen to the highland, and the real imperative for supporting Ukraine on security?
But, this is exactly why it's good we have that long experience, because this, some of what's happening now, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes, as has been said by wiser people, and so the experience of how to maintain relations with the Soviet Union, as it was called at the time, also in the midst of Cold War is helpful these days. We do not share sovereignty over Svalbard. Svalbard is Norwegian.
Yes, I'm just saying on some of the mineral rights.
But you are right that thanks to the Svalbard Treaty, which number of countries, including Russia, as I know, they have rights as other countries have, and they are active, and it's true, we manage that, and that goes quite well. But also it goes well because Norway is firm on whose sovereignty it is, it's ours. And I'm also, I have to say, really happy that we managed to delineate the economic zone, because we had, and this is interesting because it's interesting because people follow other sea-based conflicts like the South China Sea. What was happening in our case is that both Russia and Norway argued that we need to apply the Law of the Seas Convention. It was not like one believed in the Law of the Seas Convention, the other didn't. But there were two ways of reading it. One was, technically speaking, one was the sector line and the other one was the median line. And surprise, surprise, our lawyers found the version that was best for us, and their lawyers found the version that was best for them. And we discussed this for first 20 years with the Soviet Union, and then another 20 years with Russia, altogether 40 years. And after 40 years of discussing this, we came up with the idea that we could divide it into two, which one arguably could have come up with sooner, before 40 years had gone. But that means that this was then settled. So we have no remaining territorial disputes or disagreements. We also had a minor issue with our exact border delineation that was very technical, but it's still good to have it done. And basically the Arctic, which is our north, has no serious disputes left. They're all solved, all the meaningful ones, all that could have any relevance, and that is actually helpful for our local security environment. So there's nothing to pick up to quarrel about. But I mean, what we bring with us from that experience is that we need to be extremely firm on who's right and who's wrong. We are a big supporter of munitions. We have the air defense system of Kyiv, and key sites in Ukraine is NASAMS, which is a Norwegian air defense system, working closely with some American producers, but it's a Norwegian-developed system. It's extremely effective. It basically shoots down what you fire at. Washington is defended by this system, by the way.
A little-known fact.
Even if Americans tend to prefer American equipment, they wanted something that worked when they wanted to defend Washington, so they bought a Norwegian system. That was a sales pitch. But we'll
have one on Brookings before you know it.
And we also have, for European standards, a rather significant artillery shell production. So we are sort of deep into the war supporting Ukraine. But we're still able, for instance, to agree on how to manage fish stocks in the Barents Sea, and I think that is because we have that experience and it works.
Yeah, and it's also important to emphasize what you just said at the very beginning, that you were very clear on who has sovereignty, which of course is at the root of this huge problem that we're facing in Ukraine, and Ukraine itself also is having a dilemma in the international arena of emphasizing that Ukraine has sovereignty over its own territory, because Russia never made any formal claims. In the case of Norway and Russia, you had competing claims, which is why it took 40 years. In the case of Ukraine, Russia never made a formal claim and just invaded, which of course has thrown everything onto its head. So I mean, I'm also wondering if Norway can use that experience, that diplomatic experience, in helping Ukraine in some way with its 10-point peace plan, for example.
And yes, we are. Whether that experience, I don't know, but I mean, at least that in more general sense, I think that could be relevant. And we are deeply involved in, being very adamant and clear that Ukraine has to decide when it's time to negotiate a settlement, and that has to be done from a position of strength, and at the moment where they are gaining something. What something is up to them to decide, whether that's territory or something else. But that's a Ukrainian decision. But almost all wars end with some kind of negotiation at some point. And I think what the military influences is where you start those negotiations and what position you negotiate from. And of course, there you need, what is imperative, I think, now is that what comes out of such a negotiation when it happens is clear, that you have clarity, certainty, what is what. Because it's what we're seeing in many parts of the world, but particularly now in sort of east, not what we used to call Eastern Europe, but that what is east of the old Eastern Europe, which then was parts of the Soviet Union, is that wherever there's uncertainty, there's room for quarrel. You know, if you know, once you're a member of NATO, you know that you're a member. You know, and they know that we're members. That's a massive comfort. But as long as you don't have that, you have to deal. So you need to come out of this with something that is clear and lasting. Otherwise, you just wait for the new round.
Right. And, you know, I think there's a very important message in there as well about, as you're saying, not also prejudging, you know, where you might end up in this, even if at some point there might be a negotiation. And talking about negotiations, and of course, Sweden is in the final stages, trying to, you know, kind of dot the I's and cross the T's of joining NATO. Finland has also joined, and this is a huge change from 1949, obviously, when Norway made that decision to join. I mean, your immediate neighbours, Sweden and Finland, did not. I mean, how do you think, you know, that has really changed the calculus now, and how does it affect the perceptions of security for Norway and the region in the Baltic and in the Arctic? I mean, both are, at least maybe not as directly and large Arctic powers as, but they're adjacent and they're part of the whole Arctic Council. I mean, how do you think this affects a lot of these other calculations? These, by the way, are some of the questions that came in on the sheet, so I am weaving some of the other people's questions into this as well.
You qualify as Arctic if part of your territory is north of the Arctic Circle.
Exactly.
And so they qualify just like the US because of Alaska, and of course Canada qualifies, and all that do are in the Arctic Council.
Yeah.
So they're definitely Arctic, and they're also Baltic, and they're Nordic, and they're Nordic-Baltic, and all these formats. Massive change. You know, this is really, and this is good. I mean, my God, one of the things that we don't know exactly what Putin achieved, but what he clearly achieved was to convince Sweden and Finland to join NATO. That was definitely not part of the playbook, because that's a strong enhancement of Western security, and we welcome that big time. And I have to say, I was very impressed by the ability of the then leaders. Both governments are replaced now, but the then leaders of Finland and Sweden, who really understood that this time is different. Remember, Sweden had not been in any war since, you know, around the Napoleonic Wars, and managed to be non-aligned, neutral. And so their choice not to join NATO in 1949 was based on the fact that they'd done quite well in that position, and they thought they would continue that. Finland, somewhat differently, because they couldn't really join NATO. So the best they could do was to try to maintain their system with this friendship pact from Russia, which was not very friendly and not invented in Finland, but which they still managed to, you know, become a normal Western country with that partnership. Both of them realized, and this is leadership, this is true leadership, because sometimes you have this inbuilt conviction that things have to be the same, and then you see now it's really different, we have to act. And in weeks, they just changed the whole thing around. Remember, these were center-left green governments. Not the most likely governments to suddenly apply from NATO, but they realized that history was now moving, and these historic windows open, and then they close. So they acted when they opened. That, of course, means that Norway, and again, as I don't expect everybody to have the map of Nordic countries present, Norway is to the west of the big peninsula, which is Sweden and Finland and Norway, Sweden and Finland to the east. And Norway then gets a strategic depth, it gets allies, it completely alters how we plan for defense, and it also strengthens Nordic cooperation, which has been strong on non-security issues, but now also become security. Of course, NATO is the vehicle, but we can also sort of strengthen that. And add to that the three Baltic states are NATO members. And again, if you now go back 30 years, the Baltic was a sea surrounded by either Soviet states, or Russia and the three Baltics, or two neutral states, and just a little slice of Norway, and if you're very friendly, a tiny piece of Norway in the Baltic. Now it's the other way around. It's all NATO minus Leningrad and Kaliningrad. So of course, the security landscape in that part of Europe has really changed, and it is now being changed further because of the war in Ukraine. This is a lasting change, whatever else happens.
I think it's just important to bring that out, because it really is a profound shift from where we've been at any time in the past. There's another dimension of this, of course, because further into the Arctic you have another territory, Novaya Zemlya, which is, of course, where the Russians or the Soviets have traditionally tested nuclear weapons. And of course, you've got nuclear submarine bases in the Arctic. You've had a lot of dumping of nuclear waste or sunk submarines. It's been a perpetual problem in the area. But one of the reasons that both Finland and Sweden decided also to join NATO was the nuclear saber rattling of Vladimir Putin, particularly for the Finns, thinking they could defend themselves as they have done since the Soviet invasion in 1939, but obviously not against any threats to use tactical nuclear weapons. And Sweden, ironically, of course, was leading the charge to have nuclear weapons banned, and then has now obviously made a decision to join a nuclear alliance, essentially, which, of course, is what NATO is. How does Norway think about that nuclear aspect of this conflict and of that proximity to Russia at this juncture?
So we, the Novaya Zemlya and the Kola Peninsula holds the most advanced strategic weaponry that Russia has. Apart from they have silos, inland silos with ICBMs and so on, but everything else is basically naval based. And since the Black Sea has become a very different place, of course, lately. So they've concentrated much of their nuclear forces, and also much of the testing. They're not testing nuclear detonations, of course, but the missile, the delivery systems is being developed right outside our door, basically, which also give us an orchestra place to visit. Follow it. So in close cooperation with this country, we are picking up what they're doing, and which is very important also in our bilateral relationship to know exactly what's going on there. So this is crucial and a sort of lasting part of Norway, U.S. partnership for strategic reasons. However, we don't really feel. When it comes to Ukraine and nuclear weapon, I think we were more worried in the beginning.
Yes, a year or so ago.
Because you hadn't really tested. What do you actually do if what will actually happen? Just think 2 years back. We have to help Ukraine. They need to prevail. Anything else is unacceptable. But we are putting relatively advanced equipment, including F-16s and missiles and so on, into a country fighting a nuclear power. I think people were more worried about it in the beginning. Maybe we should be more worried, but I think we have kind of found the modus vivendi where this is out of the question. And interestingly, if China has contributed anything positive to this, it is we have a strong reason to believe that they have told Russia that that's an absolute threshold. They will not, for a second, tolerate anything further, not use, but also not more cyber rattling, because they don't like that, and that's been helpful.
No, I think that's been extremely important. I want to make a transition from the nuclear weapons side of things to sort of energy and power in all contexts, because one thing that we have seen in the Russian case is them really imperiling Ukraine's nuclear power production. It's the second largest nuclear power producer after France. The Zaporizhzhia plant is the largest in Europe. We also saw them going through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And the whole part of this nuclear energy production side of the equation here has become extraordinarily problematic. But that really kind of raises an awful lot of questions about the future energy relationship between Europe and Russia over the longer term. And obviously I think that's going to be something tricky to think about. And you've got another ringside seat to that, and I'm wondering how you see that evolving over time too.
So two excellent points and I mean to both. Zaporizhzhia, which this large nuclear power plant with it's the biggest in Europe, as you said. It has 6 reactors in a row. Massive producer of electricity. That had worried us more than nuclear weapons. And actually, we are now following, our services are following the weather patterns. Just to see how much warning time would we have, depends on where the wind blows. We're not so far away, and we experienced this at Chernobyl. A lot of the fallout from Chernobyl ended in Norway and Sweden.
That's right.
Because of by coincidence, because if it was another day, it might have been West Germany, but it happened to be us. So we've seen this before. So even an unintentional consequence of war close to that plant could have been very serious for us. So this is still something that we are very high on our radar. And here, of course, the International Agency for Nuclear Weapons, IAEA, have been helpful in trying to secure the plant. And then the question of energy. So when we distribute the tasks of helping Ukraine, because there's a very good Western coordination on not only that there should be support, but who can do what. We take in energy logically as an energy provider ourselves, is very high on our agenda, which is to help them to develop alternative sources of energy, help them with gas in the short run, also help them to electrify in the long run. We have some compatibility between our electricity systems, so our experts have been able to quickly replace destroyed equipment so that you turn on the electricity, which particularly in winter in Ukraine, which can be quite harsh, matters. It's life and death. Actually, if a block of flats is without electricity for days, that can be seriously damaging. But again, I mentioned Sweden and Finland. Another lasting consequence is Europe's energy independence. And interestingly, and since in one of my previous capacities was climate and environment minister.
Yeah, I was thinking about you, see.
I actually take some pleasure in saying that, you have both, Putin has both contributed to making Europe much more wary of dependence on Russian gas and accelerated the green transition in Europe, because you basically were much better off in Europe. I say, because we were good, we have all this gas, but Europe, the continent, is much better off now than we thought we would be, because we found other sources. It was sort of other deliveries of pipelines, including us. It was LNG from here and elsewhere, and a massive investment in clean energy production and grids, which you need both. So a lot of things that were in the long-term pipeline, which would have taken 10 years because of local resistance to everything, windmill and so on, is now being speeded up. And that will leaving a lasting, more independent, energy-independent Europe. That's bad for Russia because, oil is a global product. You can sell it anywhere. You just have to get it on a ship and you go to wherever you like. But gas is most effectively sold by pipeline, and that takes a lot. To build pipelines to China takes a lot of time and a lot of investment. So that's not easily replaced. So you have both changed the energy landscape of Europe on the consumer side, but also on the producer side, thanks to that war. And that's a good change, I think.
Yeah. Unfortunately, though, I mean, as you're pointing out, it takes a long time for the change to come through. And I think, if we look now at all of the pushback of support for Ukraine, it's coming from countries in particular that are still very much dependent on Russian gas. Because although we've had the ending of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 for Germany, we keep forgetting that Russia's gas infrastructure that was built in the 70s in the Soviet period to parts of Eastern Europe that were then in the bloc, the Soviet bloc, to Hungary, Slovakia and others, that gas is still flowing. And of course, Ukraine is still, for now, a transit country of gas. I mean, ironically, in the midst of the war, but it's coming up for renegotiation. Yeah, for this year, exactly. So I'm really kind of wondering, I mean, you're working with Ukraine right now. Obviously, Norway is not in the European Union. I mean, how can we address the fact that the countries that are pushing back on support for Ukraine, like Hungary and Slovakia, are still, very much dependent on Russian gas? And with the European Union elections, the Parliament coming up and a new Commission, I suspect that this is going to be, and I think probably others are probably suspecting the same thing, this is going to be a big fight in this year.
But for fairness, I have to say, yes, these two countries you mentioned are dependent on Russian gas, but so are many others.
That's true.
And look at Lithuania, to take a brave small country close to us. I mean, they were totally dependent 2 years ago. Now they're totally independent. Mm-hmm. Totally independent. So they really made it to change around because they wanted to. So there's also something about will and agency here. And of course they got help from us and others. And this is, so yes, you're right, we're not in the EU, but we're the most connected non-member and we're part of this energy union. We're deep, we have electricity grids and gas pipelines all over. So we've been part of that, also building a new pipeline to Poland, which can then distribute further to Baltic states. So there's been a systemic adaptation to this in Europe. That said, you're right that we are interested, to put it diplomatically, in the next European Parliament election and the next different national elections that will happen, because the populist right is growing, not to a dominant force, but to a force that is stronger than it used to be, and they tend to have more sympathy for Putin than other parts of the political spectrum.
Yeah, so this is going to be a very complicated issue in this year, and as you've very clearly laid out from Norway's perspective, it's directly linked to your security. In the interest of moving along so we can bring in the audience, I want to bring up another set of questions that was probably fairly obvious from your perspective. I mean, there's been also, in the context of war in Ukraine, a lot of criticism of Europe being completely focused on the war in Ukraine to the detriment of conflicts everywhere else. You've obviously been involved quite extensively in conflict resolution negotiations outside of Europe and in many different contexts. And of course, we think about what's happening now in Israel and Gaza. Norway played a really critical role in thinking through the whole of the Middle East conflict for a very long time. I mean, the Oslo Accords were negotiated in Norway, and you haven't stepped back from thinking about this in diplomatic terms. So if there's criticism a lot of other European countries, I don't think it can fall quite so heavily on Norway. But clearly right now there's a lot of pressure on Europe to step up elsewhere and to push Ukraine to one side. And we're also hearing from many other countries around the world that too much of this focusing on Ukraine, what's happening in Israel and Gaza, is of massive global consequence. This is where all of the efforts should be. I mean, how are you managing that out, particularly given Norway's really critical role so many years on the Middle East conflict?
Sophia, and I literally think about this every day.
I imagine.
I really do, because you're absolutely right and spot on. And thank you for mentioning. I think, frankly, Norway is really doing everything we can in the Middle East. That's not good enough, by the way, because as long as the killing goes on, it's not good enough for any of us. But we're really trying. So is Anthony Blinken, who's there now, and so on. But since we had this chairmanship of the so-called donor group for Palestine, which came out of the Oslo Accords, where we lead it, and the US, EU are co-chairs, and then the Arabs and Gulf states are part. So we have stepped up on this, and we're now working on strengthening the PA, the Palestinian administration. The opposite. Remember that Hamas is not only the enemy of Israel; it's also the enemy of Fatah and PLO and the people who run Ramallah, the West Bank. And part of the solution to the Middle East is to embolden and strengthen, politically and economically, institutionally, those people who are willing to have peace with Israel. And they are not in Hamas; they are in the other set of actors in Palestine. And we believe that is a key to peace there. So this is something we do. But to your question, which I think the essence of your question is, has Europe and maybe the West been so focused on Ukraine that we forgot about the rest? Yes. I mean, we have not been too focused on Ukraine because we needed to, but we should have remembered that there were a lot of people on the planet have other problems. Yeah. And their problems did not become less relevant for them, although we put our focus on Ukraine. And in the first phase, which I would say the first year and a half, so before 7th of October and the terrorist attack on Israel and the response from Israel. Before that, the problem was basically that most countries in the global south would say, yes, we agree, you shouldn't invade another country. Russia was wrong, but you're forgetting about, Sahel or the Horn of Africa or
Sudan, where you've been active as well.
So that was the first phase, which then undermined Western credibility. And now, after the Middle East blew up again, there is a much harsher critique, which is that you're not applying the same standards. You're not as worried about people in Gaza as you are with people in Ukraine. The point now is not so much whether that's true. I mean, I think it's partly true, but that is not really the point. The point is that perception is there for real. And this perception has been developed, of course, by people in the Arab street, the Arab governments, the global south in general, in South Africa and Brazil and India. This is really the talk of the town, and that's a problem for the West.
Yeah.
And it's a problem, and we can say it's not true, okay, but we're not getting through on that. So that's why I'm saying, thinking about this. We've taken a strong position on the Middle East because we think it's the right thing to do, but it also has that dimension that we simply have to demonstrate that if we appeal to some key principles like the rule of law, the UN treaty, international humanitarian law, if we believe that in Ukraine, we have to believe it elsewhere as well. Right. And if we're seen to pick principles depending on who our friends are, nobody will believe us anywhere. And this is now coming to undermine the Ukraine effort. Not in NATO, with a question mark around Washington right now, which is a big one, by the way, but more on the outside. And if on top of that we are not staying, together and solidaric with each other in the NATO family, we're in big trouble, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a really critical issue, and as we think about this over the course of the year, it's going to become much more of an acute topic. And I mean, I'd like to ask in that regard, there's a question about how, you put together, in fact, that's what everybody's trying to do at the moment, some kind of process to get out of the dreadful, catastrophic situation that we're in, right now, and obviously looking back at what was done, Oslo Accords and many other, factors there as well. With the EU elections coming up, the EU looks like it's not really going to be a kind of a major actor, although obviously there's going to be, transition, and we'll still have many of the players like Borrell and others in place. I mean, is there a scope? And then I also wonder, even internally and domestically in Norway, for Norway to play a larger role, or for some of the neighbours like Sweden and Finland, who haven't perhaps got the same kind of bad reputation, kind of around the rest of the world as perhaps some of the European neighbours, further to the south. But it's also a question of how your own domestic politics are thinking about this as well, because obviously it's a critical issue here. It's a very divisive issue. It's one of the reasons why we're also careful trying to talk about it. I mean, it's not just college campuses. It's everybody's got an opinion on this. How is that playing out in Norway? So,
Ukraine and then Middle East. On Ukraine, we have, when we adopted this, what we call the Nansen program, which is this long-term support package, military and civilian, it was supported by every single party in Parliament, every member of Parliament, sort of 100%, which is quite unique. There are hardly any decisions in, that support by everybody, but everybody signed up, from the far right to the far left. We have small parties on both fringes. They supported it. On the Middle East, actually, we have a very united Parliament as well. It doesn't necessarily seem so, because, from my obviously subjective perspective, some are trying to, say because we do not do more, we're not really committed enough. But when it comes to the key issues, for instance, we're debating maintaining funding for UNRWA, very broad support in Parliament. Whether we should work for a two-state solution now, very massive support in Parliament. Should we be clear on the fact that although we recognize Israel's right to defend itself, we also have to hold them to the principles of international humanitarian law? Very broad support in Parliament. So we haven't really experienced that type of division that you have here, for instance, not yet at least, and I hope it will stay that way.
Well, that's,
and I have to say that is very, for a foreign minister, that's very good to know.
Yeah.
That you actually, you're not going out in the world with a small majority behind you, but you have solid support. And people want us to be active. I mean, there are probably more people wanting us to do more than less. So if people are unhappy with the government, which happens everywhere, statistically it's more likely that they want us to be more engaged in these conflicts, not that they are less engaged. I think that's different from some other countries.
Well, that definitely puts you...
Without mentioning names.
Yes. Obviously, because you've only just begun your visit here, so... But that obviously puts you in a rather unique position, and, perhaps, one that gives opportunity as well as obviously brings risks, given, as we've just heard, some of the the issues that you have to contend with, of proximity in particular to Russia, but all of the other complexities there. I mean, I'd like to turn this now over to the audience. I think we've covered a lot of that. I think I've covered most of the questions that came in from outside. A lady here. And are we finishing at 3:45? Yeah, okay. Lady here, please.
I'll be real fast. Thank you so much for a really interesting discourse. And my question has to do with Svalbard and hybrid war. So you talked about nukes and militarizations and Murmansk and et cetera. And I was recently up in Tromsø, and then before that, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, in Svalbard. And it looks like I never heard the term before, something called hybrid war and hybrid threats. And a combination of Russia's presence pushing the edges of environmental policy, saying it interferes with our commercial capabilities, referring to the Svalbard offshore from 12 to 200 miles continental shelf being international waters, and basically moving toward a sort of a divide and conquer the West, so to speak, because there are different points of view, I think, as you pointed out, in Europe. And the U.S., I understand, doesn't take a position on this at this point. And BRICS, there's a sort of a little foreign policy growing up in Barentsburg, where the BRICS are being brought in, which have expanded. And then an interest in the maritime Arctic writ large in terms of domination, shall we say, all operating within the framework of the current rule of law. How do you look at this? Is this a hybrid threat? Is this just business as usual? People have said, oh, this has always happened. Or is there an increase, an acceleration, if you will, of the challenges that are coming from Russia in the high north, both in terms of the maritime Arctic and then Svalbard in particular as a staging ground? Thank you.
Good question. Well, I mean, when it comes to the Arctic Sea in general, of course, because, but not Svalbard now, but sort of further east, indeed, we see a lot of military activity at sea, because the northern fleet of Russia has this as its home base and its training ground, and they are very much related to the strategic capacities of Russia, and they are active, and we see weapons being tested and so on, as I mentioned. But whereas the land forces are basically all gone to Ukraine, and actually the brigades that are stationed close to us are almost empty, because they are moving and dying by the thousands in Ukraine. So it affects us slightly differently. But when it comes to Svalbard, so far things are happening within the set rules. There's always some push, but we push back. And it's ours, and we're sovereign, and we have, again, in my previous capacity, we have actually strengthened the environmental regulation in Svalbard, applying to everyone there, Norwegian, Russian, everybody else who might be around. Unrelated to this, because this is actually a consequence of climate change making the Svalbard environment more sensitive. But we are not, in any way not doing what we think is the right to do, and it will apply, and we make sure it applies to everybody. But it's clearly a topic we follow closely. I would put it that way. But it's still definitely contained, but we follow closely.
Thank you. Question, this gentleman here, and I'll come down here. Yeah.
Hello, and thank you for being on this wonderful panel. My question sort of meshes both the topics of energy and energy particular to nuclear and interdependence, and Norway's sort of role in that. So that being said, how have the lessons learned from Russian interdependence and the weaponization of it, particularly through natural gas and enriched uranium, how have those sort of taught lessons that will further inform resource diversification strategies, which are going on now throughout Europe, and innovative steps towards more carbon-free solutions?
Excellent. And this is, it's really important. It's a really important question, and it's really one of the very clear long-term effects of this is that people are rethinking interdependence with countries like Russia and potential other countries of the same nature, that you simply cannot allow yourself to be that dependent. Trade is okay, and not now, of course, but in normal times. But to become so dependent will then give a tool that can be weaponized. That was what happened. And to be very honest, many American governments of different colors have been making that point to Europeans, and not all Europeans listen. So it's not that nobody thought about it, but particularly one large West European country thought it was the other way around, that, you know, by interdependence we would all become friends and similar, but that didn't happen. So that's one lesson. And the other one is, of course, that, you know, if we do what we should do anyway, which is to make sure our energy becomes clean, which we should do to save the planet, that also tends to mean that you become more energy independent, because everybody has a piece of sun or wind. So when you refine the technologies to transform that into energy, you reduce emissions, but you also become more independent. However, a side effect is that the materials you use to build the solar panels and the batteries for electric cars and the windmills, comes from rare earths and minerals that you also need to look into. So I think sort of where the 20th century was very much the story of the geopolitics of fossil fuels, who has it, who transported, which route. I think the 21st century will very much the geopolitics of these critical elements that you need to build all the new technology. And we're seeing in all Western countries, you're seeing a very clear return of industrial policy. And here in this country, there's the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which of course it is not, but it was called that to get Joe Manchin's vote. But which is a massive subsidy program with some protectionist elements to it. Europe has a different set, but the same direction. In Asia, they always had industrial policy, and not only China, but also South Korea and Japan never really gave up on it. So the connection between the market and the state has really changed compared to the liberalization phase, and that is driven, I would say, first and foremost by climate, but also by strategic autonomy. And this is another mega trend I think will continue, but it's not like if we have solved Ukraine, we'll go back to normal. This is a lasting lesson. And again, just to be very clear, it's also good because it reinforces the green transition. And it reinforces an understanding in countries like ours, and Norway, Sweden, European countries, America, Canada, that you can't just have a world where we sell derivatives at the stock exchange and everybody else makes things. You actually have to make things, and you have to identify the stuff that you make things from in our countries as well. So that's a big change from where, what we were thinking at the height of globalization a decade ago.
Well, I want to be mindful of your time because I know that you have other meetings to get to. I saw 3 hands. Maybe I could take these questions together if that's okay. I'll try to make a note of them as well. There's a lady here, the gentleman in the black sweater, and then the gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Very quick question. Thank you so much for being here. As you know, the Russian presidential elections, or what they still call elections for some reason, is going to be...
Who's going to win?
So, yeah, exactly. But there is some prediction that very shortly after the election, there's going to be an intensified crackdown on civil society in Russia, and particularly, potentially, very possibly, a second wave of mandatory military conscription. What's going to be Norway's policy on accepting asylum seekers? Because, you can't claim conscientious objection in Russia. You go to prison for that.
Great question. Karen, the gentleman behind you? Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
You have discussed in a general way the issue of possibility of use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I'd like to push you a little bit further, specifically, since you are probably one of the best people in the world to have an opinion on this. If Putin and his colleagues in leadership in Russia were to suffer a complete military defeat in Ukraine, what would you estimate is the possibility that they would resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons? And is it 0%? Is it 99%? Is it 50%? What's your estimate of the likelihood in face of a total military defeat of Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this scary question. And the gentleman here. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, Foreign Minister. Thank you for being here with us. My name is John. I'm a student here at George Washington University Elliott School. My question is, with the U.S. Congress cutting down fundings for Ukraine, is Norway stepping up and increasing its economic and military assistance to Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, take them in whichever order you would like to.
I'll take the easier one last, John. In a sense, we already did, although within the program, without expanding the program, we front-loaded quite a big sum recently because we saw the delay in both the US and the EU. So because the idea was to have this distributed over 5 years, but we took some of the money, towards us in time for that precise reason. But of course, if we actually end up, and God forbid, but if we actually end up in, no continued support from the US, but this, I don't think that's happening, but I mean, you might know better. Then I think that all Europeans need to think very seriously about what we then do. But for the moment, we are working with our biggest ally to convince them that it's in everybody's interest, also the US, to continue this support, and then we will take necessary steps. But of course, the thought has occurred to us. I think that's what I should say. And again, I should, by this way, say one thing which is a little sad, but for instance, right now on land, the front line is quite static. Mm-hmm. It's better at sea because there's actually some Ukrainian progress in the Black Sea, which is very good. And Norway has a particular partnership with Ukraine together with the UK on strengthening their maritime military capacities, because that's a place where you can see dynamics develop. But when you have a very static front line, something very unfortunate happens, which is, as long as you have if warfare was dynamic, Ukraine would benefit from better training, better preparations, better intelligence support, more precise weapons, more ability to use mobility in their favor, even if Russia were larger in size. But when you have a very static front line like you have now, and people have digged in, it's almost like Verdun in the First World War. So it's exactly the type of war we all thought that military academies should not happen again, but it's now happening again. Then actually what matters is volume. So even if Russian shells are less precise, you just have more of them, and you hit anyway. So having better equipment doesn't really help Ukraine. So you need the volume. And then that was a preface to say the problem we're seeing now is not necessarily lack of money, but it's lack of capacity to produce enough munitions, missile repairs for the military system they have in time. And you can't just throw money at it, because the production lines doesn't get any bigger overnight just because you throw money at it. So if we order a big chunk of more munitions to give them, the company producing munitions will put them after the current order. What you need to do is make sure that order is produced simultaneously. So there's now a lot of work domestically, but also among NATO allies to enhance simultaneous production. Russia has done that. So Russia is to a much bigger extent now in a war economy mode, which of course is costly for them on other fronts, but they are able to produce this stuff. The stuff they produce is not very impressive, but there's a lot of it. Mm-hmm. Volume then matters. But so that was the answer to your question. Unfortunately, there's not that much civil society left to punish, but I'm sure they will try. And of course, as a neighbor, we will follow that with deep concern. I mean, the principles for apply, when they are universal in Norway, they're not so specific for a country. But I mean, if you fulfill the criteria, you will it will be applied. But I think the main answer is to move out of this horrible situation. But of course, we have a lot of contacts in Russian civil society. The problem right now is that they might not want to hear from us because they will be seen as foreign agents, right? But it's a sad situation domestically in Russia. And let's not forget about ordinary Russians, because these people are not the ones who started this war. And one day we need to be able to work with them again, even if we don't like, to put it carefully, the current regime, and will not be able to work with them as long as you have this regime in Russia. And that takes me to the most dramatic and most difficult question. That is a factor. Our assessment is that Putin, although he says the opposite, is not that much. He doesn't that much care about Russia as such. It's his own and his friends and his regime's survival. And in a situation where they are extremely, pressed to the absolute extremes, I don't think there's a high probability. But as long as it's higher than zero, we have to factor it in. Because you can't really, which also means that when, hopefully, when this war ends with some negotiated position, I hope it ends in a way where Ukraine will be sovereign, free, independent, democratic, able to make their own choices, join whatever alliance they want to, which probably is NATO and the EU, and control most of the territory. But I'm not sure, to be frank, if Western leaders want it to be, at the price of a total collapse of Russia, right. For, among other reasons, that one. So it is a factor that is lingering in there. I think, as I said earlier, we were less concerned about the probability of actual use of tactical weapons has gone down. But any situation which involves any chance obliges you to think about that fact, and I think that's the best I can say about it. We are aware, but of course, it was also said. I mean, again, it's not that China had been that helpful, but this has been helpful because I think that's been a very important message. And remember, China is 10 times bigger. The economy of China is 10 times larger than Russia. It's a completely different scale, and they're not two equals. It's sort of massively more important in the world in the long run, even if the current war is in Russia. So they can't really upset them in that way. And I mean, Russia can't. And I don't think that, although they declared some kind of limitless friendship, I don't think that's true. I think there are limits to that, which I think we should all be happy about it, which is also a reason not to treat China as a second Russia. And I think that's an important message here. Indeed, we agree with de-risking, and we should definitely, be careful about the same thing about becoming overly dependent and so on. But it's not Russia too, and if we treat them as Russia too, that might not be to our benefit either.
That's a very important point that you've just left us with. I mean, we didn't really, talk about China.
Seminar,
but obviously Norway's got its own relationship with China. You had a few blips with the Nobel prizes at different points, and panda diplomacy didn't go too well for you for a while, but you seem to have, got through some of that.
I flew in from China this morning.
Oh, you did? Excellent. Did, Okay, so that's good to hear, because
the logical road between Oslo.
I mean, I did want to ask you, just as we wrap up here, whether you think that Norway can play a role also in just as an interlocutor with China on these issues, because part of it really kind of comes down with whether China can help tamp down some of these tensions, and whether they have an interest in it being the Middle East, because that affects China's bottom line for energy, and also with Russia. I mean, it seems they obviously do not want Russia to collapse either.
No.
But do you think there is still some hope for diplomacy with China?
Yeah,
from your perspective?
Oh, yes, I do. And I do that actually just having been there.
Yeah.
And I think just to maintain, and I said there also in the Chinese media, that states it's perfectly possible to agree and disagree at the same time on different things. And I think you need an honest and good dialogue with, it's the second largest economy on the planet. They're not going to go anywhere else. They will be here, and they will be relevant. And whatever we're interested in, they are there. Just like the US is there.
Yeah.
And so we need to have that dialogue, but we also need to have a realistic entry to that dialogue.
And they're an observer at the Arctic Council as well, right?
They are observers to the Arctic Council. Yes.
Yeah.
But that means, and I actually helped them to become observers many years ago, but the argument I made is that I much prefer them to be part of our club than to make their own club. Because I cannot tell them not to take an interest in the Arctic, that they will.
They're going to be there.
There's 255 Chinese to every Norwegian, so they might, but I can say that we invite you to do that on the premise that we are developing the Arctic Council, and they agree to that.
Yeah. Well, that's a very important message, maybe for another time. The China coming in at the very end. Thank you, so much for being with us, and we wish you obviously every success in your meetings, because you're going to be talking about all of these critical issues with, let's just say, perhaps a less ready audience in some of your meetings to be, kind of engaging on some of them. But we're really delighted that you and your team came here, and our thanks to the ambassador and the Norwegian embassy here for setting everything up as well. So thank you so much for coming.
And thank you, Fiona. And I just to say, I feel a lot of expectations on Norway, but we can't do all this alone.
No, I know, exactly.
We need friends and allies, and we need to, we cannot leave the world. The world will come back and find us. We need to engage with the world, and that's something I'll bring to my colleagues at the Hill as well.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you.